Joining us now, Dr. Scott Gottlieb, former FDA commissioner on the boards of Pfizer and Illumina and a CNBC contributor. Dr. Gottlieb, this certainly was encouraging news. I know you've been calling for these fast, cheap antigen tests for a while, but why can they only be used at a doctor's office or with a nurse at this point? How far does that go to fully letting us reopen, using them on a plane or at a school or at a movie theater, for instance?
Well, they can be used more widely because they don't require a lot of sophisticated technology, so you can deploy them into a more austere setting. You still need a medical technician to apply the test under the current rules, under the current way it's being regulated. But you can push it into, for example, a school and have a school nurse administer it or have a nurse administer it in a workplace. So I think it's going to get more wide use. And even though it's not approved for routine screening of an asymptomatic population, you heard the CEO saying they're collecting additional data to prove that utility of the test. I suspect it's going to be used that way right out of the gate. And the sensitivity will go down as you use it as a screening tool for an asymptomatic population. But given the very high sensitivity of the test in a symptomatic population, you'd still expect it to be a pretty good tool for those purposes, especially given the price point and the ease of use. So this really is going to be a meaningful change in the market. You have to give Abbott some credit for investing significantly in manufacturing and coming to market with really substantial manufacturing. I think the only question is how much of the existing runs of this product have the federal government cornered. And we know the federal government stepped in with a big contract to purchase 150 million of these. And so it's not clear to me how much is going to be available for the private supply and private supply chains and how much is going to be cornered by the federal government and reallocated to schools and nursing homes, which is obviously an important use. But there's going to be other people who want to get their hands on this.
You mentioned the sensitivity, and we showed the specificity numbers as well. I guess that points to the accuracy level, because the concern with these cheap, fast tests that don't require labs and aren't the traditional PCR tests was always the accuracy levels and whether we could really trust the data coming out of them. How does this Abbott test look to you? And how much development have we seen on this front with these fast tests?
Yeah, so the sensitivity points to how likely is it to identify infection if, in fact, you're actually infected. And the sensitivity is very high. The specificity is high as well, and that speaks to how likely is it to read out an appropriate result. So if you don't have coronavirus, how likely is it to say that you do? That relates to the specificity of the test. And that's high as well, especially for a screening device of this kind. Some of the other antigen-based tests that are in the market that are perfectly good tests used in doctors' offices have sensitivity of around 80%. And so for such a simple device and an inexpensive device, this is pretty good. I would expect to see other approvals happening in pretty short order. What happens with these kinds of approvals with the FDA typically, and this is just typical, is they come in waves. And so you saw the agency initially back in February start to approve in March the PCR-based platforms. That was sort of the first wave, the platforms used in large labs. Then they started to approve the antigen-based tests that were hardware, that were in doctors' offices, like the Sophia 2 or the Abbott ID Now or the Becton Dickinson Verita system. Now they seem to be moving on to these sort of point-of-care lateral flow tests, these paper-based tests. And I would expect to see other manufacturers that have had these tests in development and under review in the agency to start to get their tests authorized as well. Obviously, Abbott was the first, but there's going to be more supply probably coming into the market from other manufacturers.
I wanted to ask you about vaccines. Obviously, there's a lot of political noise around the timing of the vaccine, but we're also in a pandemic, so we need one fast, obviously. The emergency use authorization, that's what we've seen for a lot of these treatments and a lot of these tests where the FDA just sort of fast tracks it, right, to get it out there. If we see a vaccine approved in that fashion, where it's an emergency use versus a full-on FDA approval, is that a big difference as far as safety standards? And if so, would you take it if it was approved under emergency use and not fully FDA approved at this point?
Yeah, the emergency use gives the agency a lot of flexibility in terms of the requirements. You can approve it on the basis that it may be effective. Now, if they use the emergency use authorization with the vaccine, I'm very confident that it's still going to be a very high bar. The reality is they're going to approve the vaccine or authorize it initially under an emergency use. I think it's almost without a doubt that the initial availability of a vaccine in the United States will be under an emergency use authorization, but it will be for very select populations. Think of, for example, healthcare workers or maybe patients who are in nursing homes, and they're going to require information to continue to be collected under an emergency use authorization. So almost like a registry. Right now, even in clinical development, we might have a randomized portion of a vaccine trial And then we might have a very large registry underway where you're vaccinating a lot of people. You're not randomizing them, but you're continuing to collect safety information. The initial authorization under emergency use might be that second part of the trial, if you will, where you give it to a lot of people, but you continue to collect safety information. Ultimately, licensing a vaccine for general use, I think that's not until 2021. I'm hard-pressed to see that happening in 2020 because they're going to want longer-term follow-up data. But the initial application is going to be under an emergency use. And, quite frankly, if the FDA authorized it that way, I would feel confident using it personally. But I don't think it's going to be indicated for me. I think it's likely to be indicated for people in certain higher risk settings than where I'm personally likely to fall.
Okay, that's a valuable distinction. Dr. Gottlieb, thank you.